Last NBA season, I got to take my oldest son to the Warriors game, and I'm very excited about this season. And so we get there, and you got to get there early, right? Because you have to see Steph Curry warm up. But the problem with getting there so early is you're there so early. And so then you're forced to buy overpriced food. And so we bought some dinner, and then my son, of course, wanted something to drink. And so he bought a water bottle and started drinking it. But when they gave us the bottle, they took off the cap and kept the cap and said, "Here you go." And I was like, "Hey, dude, we want the cap, because I don't know, it's just weird not to have a cap." And he's like, "Oh, sorry, sir, you can't have caps. It's part of our rules and regulations." I'm like, what's going on with caps? Are they dangerous? He's like, "I don't know. That's what the NBA says. Apparently fans were throwing them down on the court, so you can't have cap." And I was like, "Oh, well, can I get a discount on the water bottle? Because there's no cap." No, I said, "Fine, whatever." So we get the water bottle, and we're drinking it. And then, because we had time, we wanted to go to the Warriors store. So we walk up to the Warriors kind of store that was right by our seats. And we go to walk in, and they say, "Oh, excuse me, stop." I said, "What's going on?" "You can't bring in open containers into the Warriors store." And I said, "My brother, it's only open because you and your friends told me we couldn't have a top." "Oh, well, hey, I just work here, man. I'm just trying to do my job. There's no open containers here." I'm like, "It's water. What could possibly happen?" "Sir, you can't bring that in." "Oh, okay, all right, Lord." So I said, "Levi, just chug it." So Levi, chugs the water right in front of the guy. And we're like, "All right, can we go in?" He goes, "Sir, no open containers." And I was like, my faith starts to leave my body. I start to, because I'm like, "My brother, we literally drank all the water right in front of you. There is no more water in here. Is a drop gonna mess up the Steph Curry jersey that we're not gonna buy anyway? What's it?" He's like, hey man, rules are rules, no open containers." So I swallow my pride, because I was like, I'm going to Joe Lacob. That's it. I'm going straight to the top. This is ridiculous, right? But I swallow my pride, and I say, "Levi, throw away the $10 overpriced bottle of water that I wanted to refill later." And so he throws it away. And then I'm like, "Can we go inside now, sir?" He goes, "Oh, sure, come right in." I was like, oh my gosh, I was dying. And then I got inside, and I just started spitting on the clothes. No, I didn't do that. But it was so ridiculous. And it bothered me the entire game, right? Because rules, for the sake of rules, just bother me. Have you ever experienced something like that, or experienced someone like that who was so focused on the letter of the law that they lost the spirit of the law? I guarantee you, it was okay to bring an open, empty water bottle into that store, but according to this man, rules are rules. No open containers. It's incredibly frustrating. And I've been a Christian for a long time, been a pastor for a long time. Here's what I've realized, that actually, sadly, Christian and churches are really good at focusing on the letter of the law, not the spirit of it as well. Have you noticed that? I can give you 100 examples of this. Let me give you just a few. The spirit of being near to God and drawing near to him and spending time with him becomes checking off your Bible reading plan and making sure you pray for a certain amount of time, because then you just feel better about yourself. Or the spirit of God wanting you to walk in freedom from sin and repenting of sin becomes this system of sin management. Don't do the big things, don't sin in those big ways, just stay away from those, and then you'll be okay. You won't feel guilty. Or the spirit of God's desire for all people, that he loves and wants all people to come into a relationship with him, comes this pressure that churches can have to invite your friends and to pass out tracts and go door to door knocking and use every relationship for an evangelistic opportunity. Because if you don't, then God's somehow displeased with you. Now, none of those things are wrong, by the way, right? You should read your Bible, you should pray, you should talk to your neighbors about Christ when the opportunity comes. But in my life and in our life, they quickly become so legalistic. And there's this temptation is so real, because what I've learned is it's so much easier to focus more on the letter of the law than on the spirit of it, because deep down we want to manage our Christianity. We want to understand it down to the details. We want our Christianity to be a series of check off boxes so then we can feel good about ourselves. So we can feel like God is somehow pleased with us. Hey, I came to church today. God, don't you care? And all of us, we get sucked into this religious rule keeping and actually takes us away from Jesus. All of us are tempted to follow the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. Sir, no open water bottle containers allowed. And this was true back in the time of Jesus. Very, very true. In this passage we're going to look at today, the author, Mark, we've been studying his book, is continuing to unveil for us how Jesus came into this world not to just reform the Jewish religion. He didn't come to reform even religion himself. He came to end it and to replace it with himself. And that's what he's been doing. So far in Mark, we've seen Jesus deal with all kinds of controversies over legalism and religion and rule keeping. Jesus forgives sin. We saw him eat with sinners, and then last week we saw him challenge Jewish traditions over fasting. But Jesus is far from done. And Jesus today in our passage is going to challenge a much, much bigger, more intense, more widely held tradition, one tradition that the Jews held most sacred, and that was keeping the Sabbath. And so what we're going to see is on the Sabbath, two very controversial things happen. First, the disciples are picking grain when they're out in a field. And then later, Jesus is going to heal a man with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath. And you got to know that in both instances, the religious leaders believed that it was against Jewish law to do those things on the Sabbath. But Jesus will interpret both of those things very, very differently. Look with me, if you have a Bible, to Mark chapter 2, and I'm starting in verse 23. Mark tells us that on one Sabbath, important context, Jesus was going through the grain fields and his disciples walked along and they began to pick heads of grain and they popped them in their mouth. And the Pharisees said to him, this is to Jesus, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? No open water bottle containers allowed, Jesus. And he answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? You know, in days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, that's to the Pharisees, that's to the teachers of the law who were right there, who were questioning him, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. And so, Father, as we open up your word this morning, give us eyes to see, ears to hear, hearts and minds that are open to whatever it is you want to teach each and every one of us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit, we pray. Amen. Now, for most Jews, probably all Jews back then, the Sabbath was a really, really big deal. The Sabbath actually is one of the primary traditions that separated Israel for centuries from all other nations, running all the way back to the Old Testament, well into this very day. And so Jews, just like Christians, got this idea from the book of Genesis. God created the entire world in 6 days, and then what did he do on the seventh? He rested. Now, God wasn't tired from his work. He wasn't like, oh my gosh, that was so difficult, guys. I need to rest. No, he rested in the satisfaction of all he created. Like an artist doing a painting, he steps back and goes, oh man, I need to enjoy this. And then Genesis tells us that he didn't set apart the seventh day, making it holy. It's so interesting that normally in the Old Testament, places were made holy, like the temple. But this is the first time, and I think the only time in my recollection, that God makes a period of time, a 24-hour period, holy. He sets it apart. It's sacred. This was so core to the Jewish faith that it was, of course, also one of the 10 commandments. Number 4, making it much, much more than just another religious rule to follow. This was one of the 10 commandments. And so the Sabbath was also a sign of Israel's special, what's called covenantal relationship with God, right? It was the one thing that separated them from all other religions. Circumcision was the other thing. It was actually so important to Jewish identity that the Pharisees, that's these religious elite folks, added another 39 rules. They called it a fence around the practice of the Sabbath, just so no one would even come close to breaking any Sabbath regulations. And if you think if this is like an antiquated practice, actually, Missy and I were with Daryl several years ago in the Holy Land on the Sabbath, and I saw this play out. We were in the elevator, and it was so annoying. I hate to say it this way, but the elevator stops at every single floor on the Sabbath. Why? Because when you touch a button, not only does that work, but it ignites a light. And that in Jewish faith is what God did, creating light. So like it was just work. And so you couldn't press a button. So you had to wait on the floor and go, yeah, I'm on floor 10. And then after dinner that same night, we asked this woman to take our picture. And she was clearly a Jewish woman. And she said, oh no, I'm sorry, I can't take your picture. It's a Sabbath. And I was like, what? And I didn't really understand that. And then my wife did a little research. She said, oh, it's because taking a picture is creating an image. And creating an image, a photo, is work. I was like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. And that's just one of hundreds of things that Jews today don't do on the Sabbath. And so here's the disciples. They're with Jesus. They're walking through a grain field. They're picking heads of grain. The Pharisees saw them picking heads of grain. Now, here's the deal. Eating grain and picking from a field and eating it, that was not the problem. They could do that, and a lot of fields were made for that. But the issue was that they were doing it on the Sabbath, and this act was strictly forbidden because picking grain was reaping, and reaping was work, one of the 39 things that you should not do on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees, they don't question the disciples, they question Jesus, because as their rabbi, Jesus should be responsible for their behavior. And they say, oh, Jesus, they're working here. What's going on here? Why are you allowing this? And in Jesus' response to the Pharisees, you'll see what he'll do all the time. He listens to their question. You know what he is back? He asks another question. He loves to do that. And then he'll then answer his own question because they're stunned in silence. And so Jesus goes straight to the scriptures. He goes all the way back to the Old Testament. He goes back to King David, and he's going to explain to them why, in his interpretation, picking grain on the Sabbath was okay. And he says, hey, you remember King David? You remember his words? You remember 1 Samuel 21? And of course, they're like, of course, we've memorized it. We know that story well. Oh, really? He said, you remember what David's men did? He's like, yeah, they went to the temple and ate the consecrated bread. Oh, interesting. Now, if you read only the letter of the law, what David and his men did was unholy. They had no right to eat the sacred bread that was only reserved for the priests. It was unlawful. But David and his men were in need. They were hungry, so they ate it. And if you keep reading in 1 Samuel 21, David and his men, they were not chastised, they were not punished by the priests. They were not judged by God as we know. So clearly Jesus says they didn't violate the law, did they? And so Jesus is using this example from the scriptures because he's clearly comparing himself, King Jesus, to King David, and his disciples to David's men. And so what he's doing is he's essentially stepping back and questioning the Pharisees' entire approach to the law. He's saying that because of your strict interpretation of the law, you're completely disagreeing with not only King David, but with me, with Jesus. He's saying that you don't care that we are hungry, you just care that we follow your religious rules to the letter, but we're starving. And by following your religious rules to the letter, you're putting a burden on God's people that was crushing them and actually leading them away from God, not nearer to him. And then Jesus makes a stunning statement, further revealing his identity, a statement that will end up getting him killed. Jesus declared, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath. So what is Jesus saying here? See, on one side of the coin, he's saying, hey, remember the original point of the Sabbath? It was made for people. God didn't make people for the Sabbath. And so Jesus is affirming the original purpose of the Sabbath, the need to connect with God, the need to make room to rest. It's been built into our very DNA as human beings, not human doings. God made this for us. And so the Sabbath was designed by God to help serve people for their good. It was never meant to be a burden or to be a hindrance to our spiritual growth. The Sabbath was and always has been intended to be a gift from God to meet our physical, mental, emotional, and even spiritual needs. But he says that the way the Sabbath was being enforced by the Pharisees and others meant that they are now serving the Sabbath. They got it all wrong. They had lost the forest for the trees. They were saying no open containers allowed in this store. And so Jesus made this controversial statement because he's going to continue to squash out legalism and how the Sabbath was observed. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. That means that Jesus, in his coming as the Son of Man, as Lord, as King, he's putting things right again, which included the Sabbath. Jesus is ushering in this new kingdom, this new era. He's God's representative on this earth, and he alone has the right to determine what is good, what is healthy, and what is right on the Sabbath. He's making yet another claim to his authority. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. He controls the most sacred day of the week because he wrote the rule book. So Mark is showing us how we need to view all rules, all religious rules. We view them all in light of Jesus and his kingdom. So if Jesus said it's okay to pick grain on the Sabbath to meet a basic need of hunger, then it's not against the law. And so if that wasn't enough, Jesus is going to kick it up a notch. As if it wasn't enough to pick grain or to reap on the Sabbath, the controversy is going to just explode sometime later. Look with me. Let's keep reading now in chapter 3, verse 1. And so another time, so sometime later, maybe after these events, a few days later, a day later, we don't know, another time, Jesus went into the synagogue. Now, this is probably back in Capernaum, the synagogue that we talked about earlier, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. So a man with some type of deformity. And some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. These were the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But they didn't have to watch too closely because Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, that's the religious leaders. There's this man standing up. He asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill it?" But they remained silent. And he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at what? Their stubborn hearts. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. And the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So at this point, man, Jesus has gotten in a lot of trouble already. And he's being watched very closely. But they didn't have to watch too closely because there he is once again on the Sabbath, once again in the synagogue, probably in Capernaum. The Pharisees, the experts of the religious law are all there, and they're just waiting to catch him now. And I just think about this poor man who just is attending the synagogue service one day, and Jesus says, "Hey, stand up." And he goes, "Me? Yeah, man, you." And he stands up in front of them all. And I think why Mark does this is because he's trying to get us to feel the mounting tension rising in the room. Like, what's he gonna do? What's he gonna do? What's he gonna do? And then Jesus asks a deeply ironic and even rhetorical question. What is lawful to do on the Sabbath? To do good, to do evil, to save life, to kill. It's obvious. To do good, to not kill anyone, right? To save life. But the irony of what he asked is that while Jesus will soon do good on the Sabbath, the Pharisees will start to plot evil and eventually kill Jesus. Jesus was going for their hearts. Now, you should also know that first century Jews discussed at length what to do with someone who is sick on the Sabbath, right? And basically, you could do you couldn't do anything unless that person's life was in danger. Like if they were just sick or had COVID or whatever, leave them alone unless their life was in danger. Then you could intervene. And so what's clear with this man, his life wasn't in danger. He's probably had a shriveled hand, a deformed hand for years and years, maybe since he was a child. We don't know. And so that's not the case. And I was like, well, you know what? Jesus could have just waited. He could have healed this man on Sunday or on Monday or sometime later, right? But no, Jesus is not going to wait. Because he's revealing for us that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, and he wants to teach us what is proper to do on it. So he asks them a question, and they respond with silence. And I love that Mark not only tells us what Jesus did, he tells us how Jesus felt. He said he looked at them with anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, their pharisaical hearts, their hardened hearts. And remember, if you're with us last week, just to be fair, the problem with the Pharisees was not their desire to obey God. They wanted to obey God, right? But their problem was how they went obeying God. And again, just so we're clear, the Jewish law was not necessarily the issue either. The original intent of the law was for our good, to deepen our relationship with God. But the problem was the heart behind the Pharisees, the part behind the law. It had been overshadowed with the burden of trying to obey it. Did you know this? That the Jewish people added another 613 rules to all the other religious rules. That's found in what's called the Mishnah. I love what one author says. He says, their hearts, that's the Pharisees, were as shriveled as this man's hands. And that's why Jesus is angered at their shriveled little hearts. They don't care that this man was suffering. They didn't care that the disciples were hungry. They cared about these rules. And before you say, well, that's back then, that's not today. Well, today we call these people, you know what we call these people? Legalists. Legalists. A legalist is anyone who works in their own power and in their own strength to try and earn God's favor. A legalist is anyone who tries to make righteousness humanly possible, to make righteousness manageable. And here's the thing, if we are not careful, we can easily fall into the trap of legalism too. I do it, you do it. And so what Jesus is telling us here is not only is he the Lord of the Sabbath, he's reminding us that, hey, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath. It's okay to feed someone in need on the Sabbath. It's okay to serve the church on the Sabbath. It's okay to do good. And it's so interesting that Jesus heals this man. Nothing is said of this man's faith. This man just showed up to the synagogue on a Saturday night and gets healed. But I think Jesus, what he's doing, he's revealing to us that it's completely okay to do good on the Sabbath, to help people on the Sabbath, right? Can you imagine if your neighbor came over on today, if this is your Sabbath, and say, hey man, like, oh my gosh, I got a huge problem. Like this happened. What if you said, sorry, my man, it's a Sabbath for me. I can't help you. Jesus is saying, don't be like that. Right? Because this healing would help this man in tremendous ways. And for Jesus, let's be honest here, this was not work, right? He just says the word and this man is healed. This was an opportunity for him to do good, for him to do right before God. Honestly, to not heal the man when he had the power to do so, that, according to Jesus, would have been wrong. And that's why as Mark continues to write about Jesus, as he continues to write about this man who's the Lord of the Sabbath, we'll see, he'll show us exactly what Jesus continued to do. Look with me in verse 7 real quick. He says, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, so he withdrew. He was trying to get away. He was trying to practice the Sabbath, but when all the people heard what he was doing, many people came to him from all over, Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, everywhere. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples, hey, get in a small boat, because these people are everywhere. And for he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward just to touch him. And whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and they cried out, "You are the Son of God." But as he's been doing, he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. I don't have time to dive into this. We've been talking about this, but Jesus often, what would he do? He would withdraw to get away, to rest, to fill up, right? But he was too popular at this point. People came out from everywhere just to touch him, just to be with him, just to get healed. And I love that Jesus doesn't rebuke them. He doesn't tell them to go away because, hey, the king is trying to rest here. No, he says, come to me, and he heals them and he casts out demons. And so Mark is telling us this simple truth, that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. So yes, rest, but also do good on it. Do good on it. And you know what I realized this week? That we have the same problem as the Pharisees. Our hearts can get shriveled up too. See, our loving relationship with God becomes a chore, becomes a to-do list. We naturally slide into legalism and what Dallas Willard is famous for calling sin management. And I think the reason why Mark tells us this story is because I think one of the best antidotes to a shriveled heart, one of the best antidotes to legalism is the Sabbath. It's taking a 24-hour period of time to not do any work, but to simply rest and enjoy our Heavenly Father. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. If we want the life of Jesus, if we want to follow Jesus, then we need to learn and adapt the lifestyle of Jesus too. And that will mean learning how to make Sabbath a weekly rhythm in our lives. So here's the obvious takeaway for you. The obvious one is commit to a Sabbath. Commit to a 24-hour period of rest. If you're like, whoa, Rob, I can't do that. Commit to a 12-hour period of rest. Commit to a weekly Sabbath. Because here's the thing. Our problem is not like the Pharisees. Our problem is not that we're being too legalistic about the Sabbath. Our problem is we're hardly practicing it at all. See, Sabbath, like all the other spiritual disciplines, are meant to be transformational. They're meant to be for our good, not to be a burden. And in fact, you don't have to take a Sabbath, right? You don't have to. If you don't not take a Sabbath, Jesus is not gonna come down and smote you or judge you or whatever, right? It's an invitation to simply come and be with him. But you can choose to ignore it. And so I get asked from time to time, well, Rob, do you take a Sabbath? I go, yeah. They go, but you work on Sunday. I go, I know, Sunday's not my Sabbath. And they go, oh, well, how do you do that? And so I'll just tell you real quick what my wife and I do. For a long time, my wife and I, we've tried our best to find 24 hours a week to rest and worship, right? But it's looked different over the years. We don't have young little kids running around, which is almost feels like impossible unless you give them NyQuil in the middle of the day. But no, don't do that. And so it's changed, it's morphed over the years, especially when my kids were in sports or doing other things. You can't, be like, sorry, I can't take you to soccer because I'm resting, right? So I get that. And so today, since our kids are a little older and I take Fridays off, Missy and I usually start our Sabbath Friday morning. We hang out together. We usually go out and eat breakfast or brunch. On my Sabbath, I don't check any work-related email or Slack or Asana or any of those things. I don't even check my social media accounts. Actually, I've been taking a break from that anyway. And so that's mostly Friday. And then Friday night, we'll usually go out to eat with a couple or friends or whatever. And then Saturday mornings, these days are pretty chill for us as well, which has been awesome. And so for us, we try to read more, spend more time with God. I drink lots of coffee. We'll take the dogs on a walk. We'll watch a movie. We'll eat. And we try to do something fun, right? Because we don't want to, we've always invited our kids into Sabbath with us. We don't want to be like, hey, don't have any fun. You got to just be with God, right? Because for me, being with God is on the Sabbath, man, is golfing and it's fishing. It's a good workout, right? Like I connect with God in all those ways. For my wife, she's been doing this thing. She calls it her Sabbath bath. Well, she'll like lock herself for like hours in the bath. And I'm like, hello. But it's, candles and worship and all that is going on. And then of course, we try to spend time together as a family. Now I say all that not to say, oh, we're so good at this. No. Like we've struggled along too, but I just want you to see that we don't have like some specific agenda because life shows up, cars break down, laundry doesn't stop, right? But our heart is to do whatever we can to rest, to be with God, to be with our friends, to be with our family, right? And prepare us for Sunday, which for us is a day of work. So what about you? I'm not going to embarrass you and raise your hand, but I'm just curious. If I asked you to raise your hand and said, hey, how many of you take a weekly Sabbath? I just wonder how many of you would raise your hand. And so what I encourage you, put it on your calendar. If you're married and have kids, graciously invite your spouse and your family to do it together, right? Don't be that guy who says, honey, I can't do that. I'm taking a Sabbath. No, invite her to do it with you. Because the Sabbath is not just another burden. It's not just another rule. It's an invitation for you to be with God. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. So he says, yes, rest, refill, and also do good on it because it's in the Sabbath. It's one of the many ways where God heals our shriveled hearts too. So we're going to take communion together, and I'm going to invite the worship team back up. I'm going to invite the ushers up. You can start passing out the elements. And then I'll come back up after the song. We'll take the elements together. But this week, Tim and I were thinking about like, how can we have a kind of moment of Sabbath in our services? And Tim found this incredible worship song called Make Room. And I read the lyrics and I'm like, Tim, that's exactly it. I don't know where you found this song. That's amazing. That's exactly the heart of what Jesus is saying here. And so we're going to sing it in a moment, but let me just read the bridge. The bridge says, shake up the ground of all my tradition. Break down the walls of all my religion because your way is better. Your way is better. And then later in the verse, it says, here is where I lay it down. You're all I'm chasing now. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. And so I'm going to invite you to stand as the elements are passed. And we're going to sing this song. And it's going to be new for you, but I just want, man, you're going to love it. Trust me. And we're going to worship. May this be a prayer for us that we would make room for God, not only today, but this weekend and the weeks to come. And then I'll come back up and we'll take communion together.